We're going to give folks a minute or two to come in, and then we're going to get started. So welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied fields related to the built environment. And today we have Equity Within Urbanism, Why It Even Matters, with Marcus King and the interviewer and moderator, Mallory Botches. So you can register for coming webinars. We have one coming up September 19th on creative placemaking through art and music. And Wednesday, October 4th, repairing past harm. Do designers and planners have a role? Both of these are at 12 noon, as they always are. And go to cnu.org/resources/ontheparkbench to register or find out more. And you can join CNU or renew your membership at members.cnu.org/memberships. Find out all the benefits of doing that. And of course, check out Public Square, a CNU journal online. And today we will look at the equity issue in urbanism, featuring a young urbanist from Detroit who has made a name for himself in new urbanism in recent years. Marcus King is a licensed architect, practicing urban designer, small-scale developer, and educator. His practice is fabric design, where the focus is neighborhood-scale projects. He is also a member of the CNU Board of Directors. And Mallory Botches will be the interviewer and moderator, and has 25 years of international work in urban planning and community development, as well as a wealth of experience in nonprofit leadership. She is CNU president. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's Public Square. And first, there's going to be a presentation by Marcus, followed by a discussion with Mallory and Marcus, followed by Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you, and we'll get to them more or less in the order that they are asked. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Marcus.
All right, thank you, Rob. I'm going to share my screen here. And Rob, let me know if everything looks kosher. Hopefully that looks good. Looks good on my end.
Looks
All
good.
right. Perfect. All right. Let's get into it. It's always a good time when I get to spend a couple of minutes with let's see, a couple of hundred or so of my best friends in urbanism, talking about urbanism. And I want to thank Mallory and Rob for giving me this opportunity to talk about this particular topic. So I want to start today with a clip that I think gets at the sort of core, sort of 10,000 foot view perspective of some of the core tenets of not only this talk, but I think this sort of conversation about this unnecessarily charged word, equity, excuse me, equity in that we're having in our discussion, in our conversation today. So it's only about a minute, so we'll play this, and I think this will sort of level set and set the stage for us pretty nicely. Hopefully you guys can hear it. Should work.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
So I like showing that particular clip of Martin Luther King because it's one of the sort of to the wayside clips of some of his most prominent speeches, primarily because it tends to be a little bit controversial in talking about subsidies for land, providing mechanisms, providing a foundation for how to best capitalize on land. This entire talk is going to be centered around the unique relationship that African Americans and indeed other populations, demographics of color have had with American land. And in the context of this conversation, we're specifically talking about, for our interest, urbanism, and how urbanism historically throughout the centuries from America's founding has garnered a certain perspective within these demographic groups. And so when I last gave this particular talk, it's in a different version, but when I last gave the synopsis of this particular talk, I ended with the question to myself and to all urbanists in general, which is whether we are avoiding solving the problems that we've created and neglected in the places that we've already built, and as a result, further exaggerating those problems in doing so. It's a question. And if we are doing that, is it because it's simply just really hard, or is it because the people there, or perhaps it's a combination or a mix of these things and other things that are not mentioned? But whatever the reason is, the fact of the matter is that folks left, or certain folks are left to deal with these unresolved issues of our previously built places. And they are typically the least of us, not the least of us in terms of character or intelligence, but the least of us in terms of money and in resources and in time. Low-income families, a good deal of them which are African American and other groups of color. These folks can't afford to simply pick up and leave to the next peripheral development, nor is it sustainable to continue to expanding outward when opportunities abound inward. So what does this have to do with urbanism? I think it has to do everything with urbanism. The buildings we design, the blocks we scale, the neighborhoods we plan, and the real estate we develop, whether we realize it or not, serve as the backdrop in cities and in towns for social and economic progress and or problems. If economic vitality, as we purport in our charter, economic vitality, community stability, and environmental health can't be sustained without a supportive physical framework, then it matters that much more where we build such a framework. Because we are the stewards as urbanists in all the different facets and ways we operate within the built environment, because we are the stewards of these backdrops, we are then given a responsibility to go beyond aesthetics, form, style, ornament, all things that I absolutely love and things that we are really, really good at. We got that down pat. In the 21st century, we also have a responsibility to create physical solutions that can help solve lingering social and economic issues, lest we risk repeating those same mistakes and passing those same issues down to the next generation, like it seems like we're doing many other things these days. So I offered up a few potential solutions from my own work and advocacy to help intervene Most of these solutions are anchored in empowering folks to do the things that need to be done by removing procedural obstacles, easing the cumbersome nature of those procedures. In the final item I listed the last time I gave this talk, acknowledging the truth, embedded in that is the concept of equity, excuse me, and equity in all its forms. But in this context, what I mean is a racial equity within urbanism, racial equity within the form and space of our built environment. This is the element that I want to spend the bulk of our time this afternoon chatting about, because I firmly believe that a true rededication and restoration of core cities and towns that we've built already cannot fully happen without addressing equity issues caused by the built environment itself, by urbanism itself. Now, I acknowledge before you all that this, again, as I mentioned before, that this word equity has unnecessarily become politically charged and is often taken out of context these days when talked about. In simple terms, equity is simply anchored in truth and awareness, justice, and fairness, nothing more, nothing less. And so to describe my definition of equity, I usually use these couple of slides. And so when we talk about equality, which is different than equity, it's sort of like Oprah giving out free stuff, right? You go to the Oprah show, you might go on that one day where you're lucky enough where she's giving out whatever the most popular thing is in that particular day. Look under your seat. It's the keys to a car. It's a book. It's whatever, right? Everybody gets the same thing. Okay, that's equality across the board. Okay, separating equality and equity is this idea of a disparate impact. These are practices, procedures that are adversely affect one or several groups, people of a protected characteristic more than another group, even though the rules are formally neutral and applied equally across the board. And so to mend these disparate impacts, that's where equity comes in. Equity, this idea of just simple fairness or justice in the way people are treated, acknowledging current or past harms and maladies, right? And so, again, if we apply things equally, it sort of ignores things that have happened in the past. It ignores the mechanisms, the decisions that we've made to get to this particular point. And something needs to intervene to remedy that, and so that things can truly be equal. This is what I mean when I talk about equity. And so I want to run through some similar slides that I presented at our Congress a couple of months ago, but I want to provide a little bit of sort of timeline analysis and contrast alongside these things that are happening as our cities begin to grow and develop, excuse me, and improve over time. And I think this sort of paints the picture of how in the American context, our cities have grown, have developed, have increased in value, have benefited millions of people, but at the same time have done a lot of harm, particularly to Black American groups and other people of color demographics. So here we are in the 18th century. In a general sense, the American city in the 18th century is, from an urbanistic standpoint, is relatively efficient in terms of its walkability and its ease of accessing the different things and needs of the daily life, right? Mostly out of necessity, right? We didn't have cars back then. We didn't have trains back then, and so the precedent for designing this kernel of our cities is really steeped in tradition, tried and true methods of city building and city planning, right? On top of that, this uniquely American system of investment from a public and private standpoint is taking shape, taking form, right? Providing a stable framework for public investment and private citizens to now own land for themselves and to build something for themselves that they can then pass down to their pedigree, right? Simple equation, simple formula, right? At the same time this is happening, you have an entire population of people who weren't considered people at that time, who exist in the land but cannot benefit from these mechanisms, from these institutions. They cannot benefit from an urbanistic standpoint. They cannot benefit from the concepts of that we purport in a modern sense, these concepts of walkability and freedom to walk about and move and access goods and services, right? And I'm not just saying that from hyperbole. This is coded in law through a set of laws that we now call slave codes or code noir in some of the West Indies or the Caribbean. Just about every colonial and early American city before slavery was abolished had a slave code. And essentially these slave codes were put in place to dictate how these enslaved Africans, they're not African Americans yet, these enslaved Africans were to move about public space, how they were to interact with public space, how they were to live and be treated on the land. There's 6 core concepts throughout all slave codes, but 4 of them, in my opinion, relate directly to the built environment. And those are restrictions on movement, restrictions on social engagements, establishments of slave patrols, essentially the precursors to policing systems, and then the regulation of slave punishment. Now, how does this relate to the built environment? Well, as I stated before, there were restrictions on movement. The enslaved were not allowed to move about the plantation nor move about the city itself freely without a pass from their quote unquote white masters, right? Restrictions on social engagements. Enslaved persons were not allowed to gather in public space, again, without permission from their enslavers. Perhaps of most notable egregiousness is the regulation of slave punishment. And this relates to the built environment primarily because these punishments by law were mandated to happen in many cases, not in all, but in many cases were mandated to happen in public space, in the public square, the plaza, on the street for all to see, similar to a spectacle, right? And this is the way we chose to use our democratic space, the space where we are to exchange ideas. I'm a firm believer that in a democratic society, I'm a firm believer that what we purport to do in public space is a direct reflection of what we as a society hold dear to. And these are the things that we're by law allowing to happen in public space, in urbanism. And these are just some of the more sinister examples of slave codes. You have the District of Columbia, which had a slave code for a time. I think was also one of the early ones to get rid of them. But the 2 that are perhaps the most sinister, again, are the slave code of the Commonwealth of Virginia, or the slave code of the Virginia Slave Code of 1705, and then the Bayesian Slave Code, or the Barbados Slave Code, which are sort of used as boilerplate templates for other slave codes across colonial America. So I just want to show a couple of excerpts, and you guys can sort of read these as I show them on your screen. But these are just some of the excerpts that would be in some of these boilerplate slave codes that, again, are directly defining how the built environment is to treat African ethnic people pre-abolishment of slavery, but also the inverse as well. And so considered to be the most sinister of all of these, as I mentioned before, was the Virginia Slave Code. And here are some excerpts from the Virginian instance. And you can see in these early stages of the country's development, how these enforceable laws are dictating how enslaved Africans are to be treated in the public realm, having to gain permission to move around, move about the city or the plantation, and dictate and mandate what happens if that permission from a master is not given or received. Laws that prohibit the gathering and fellowship in the open and also the establishment of curfews. We also start to see laws that give credence to the murder of African ethnic persons and the full acquittal of those murders, again, in public space. There are also laws that established that and outline the punishment if the authority of a quote unquote, using the terms of the law here, the quote unquote white master was challenged or questioned by an enslaved Black person. Why is this important? Again, because these mandated beatings, these lashings, these murders were often conducted in public space, on a street, on a square, in a plaza, or if they were on private property, they were done in a public manner, as in a spectacle, as in entertainment, almost, right? And we can see remnants of that in our contemporary society. So let's move into the 19th century, right? We're into the 19th century. We're now adding additional advancements and modernisms, modern mechanisms to our cities, right? Modern plumbing and sewer systems, electricity, multimodal transit systems, rail at various scales. Public school system gets invented in this particular time frame. Housing diversity also arrives on the scene as well in this era, right? So there's a lot of things that are setting the stage for good urbanism, and for that to benefit for all people. But again, that wasn't afforded to a big swath of the demographic. And when I say big swath, particularly in the South, I mean it. So this is a diagram that outlines the density of persons in America, enslaved persons in America, particularly in the South. And the hot red areas are heavy areas of densities of enslaved persons. This is significant because what this is showing is that even though white Americans were the ones that were able to realize the benefits of improvements and capitalize on the benefits of land ownership and improvements in the built environment, they were not the ones that dominated the land. In fact, before the Civil War, African Americans occupied nearly 65% of all persons in the South. A population that is directly responsible for a crop at that time, that being cotton, which was half of the country's exports at that particular time. A population that had the ability and knowledge to work the land and the know-how to extract value from that land in the form of its bountiful harvest and crops, yet could not benefit in that labor. And yet this population had virtually no rights and certainly no political power. And so this 3/5 rule, which was instituted into the Constitution, was a contradiction in that it, for the first time, at least acknowledged in part the humanity of an enslaved person, but did so without capitulating and giving in to humane treatment. The enslaved were tallied up just like everybody else in the country and were counted as 60% of a full, quote, white person, which effectively amounted at that particular time, when there were less seats in the House, to about 15 or so additional congressional seats given to Southern states. As decisions were being made concerning the development and the planning and the modernization of cities, Black persons were exploited for political power while they existed on the land, but could not themselves benefit from such power. They could not own property or land or realize the value of simple things like modern electricity, plumbing. They were completely excluded from the pursuit of American ideals, yet were an integral part of that part of the country, at least, its existence. And just to show the benefits or the dominance of both enslaved persons and the crop that they were utilized to harvest. This is a diagram taken from a gentleman, Mr. North, who studied such things. And you can see over time, before the Civil War, the amount of enslaved persons, which is shown in blue, and the amount of bushels of cotton that were produced. And it gets so high that there's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. That's how quickly or how valued and how steeped in the economy this particular cash crop was. Now, there were obviously inventions like the cotton gin, which helped produce and speed up the efficiency of the harvest of these crops. But this efficiency factor in terms of a ratio of a person to how many bushels they were able to produce was heavily steeped in the economy of the country, no doubt, but certainly in the southern part of our country, where most African ethnic people were living at that particular time. And so that brings us again to the 19th century as we move past civil war and begin to reorganize ourselves. That brings us to a variety of different things that begin to happen, but chief among them, for our purposes in studying the urbanism of it all and the built environment of it all, is Special Field Order 15, which for the first time, to my knowledge, is the only time in America's history where the country has both publicly acknowledged the wrong of slavery and came up and put forth a proposal to make amends for that wrong. In negotiations with Union generals, the president, and various representatives of the now African-American population, or freedmen as they were called back then, the government was prepared to equip a few recently freed slaves with basic infrastructure to support themselves: a 40-acre plot, agricultural tools, and a mule. This is important because you have to consider the condition of most of these folks during the time of Reconstruction. Most of these recently freed slaves cannot read or write. They cannot talk, quote unquote, proper English, right? They speak in a dialect, of Creole or Creole, right? Very, very formatted language, just sounds different. Many of these freedmen are ignorant to culture and social norms. All have no wealth, money, or anything really of monetary value, maybe sentimental value, but not monetary value. But what they do have is a very intimate knowledge of how to work and live on the land. And this is exactly why they requested land to live on so that they can support themselves as part of the spoils of them being free and them having an economic floor, as Martin Luther King describes it, an economic floor to begin to have the same opportunity to pursue their version of the American dream. So before Special Field Order 15 could be enacted, President Lincoln was assassinated. President Johnson quickly rescinded the order and allowed those seceded states to reorganize themselves. Now we have to enter Black codes, the advanced version of the previous slave codes. Similar to its precursor, Black codes sought to exploitively tie Black Americans now to the land as cheap labor only, this time ignoring the law and the Constitution. Black codes are anchored in unrealistic labor contracts and vagrancy laws. And you can see some of the core concepts of what these Black laws were attempting to do, which was essentially reestablish a pre-slave state in after emancipation. You could be, as a Black person, you were required to, by law, sign a labor contract with again, these are the words they use, with a white master in order to get a job. Because you didn't have any tools, any wages that you might have earned from having that job were then given back to that quote unquote white master to pay for the tools that you had to use to cultivate the land. And so what we find is that this is a mechanism that, again, ties African Americans back to the land, but doesn't give them a ladder to which they can sort of climb themselves to venture into economic mobility, right? And if you didn't sign a land contract, labor contract, excuse me, with a quote unquote white master, you could be jailed, and then your services would be then rented out by the jailers two plantations in the area, and so you ended up in the same place, right? Because of the failed Special Field Order 15, the establishment of Black codes, many freedmen and women faced few options, and some attempted to flee north and west to more enlightened parts of the country. Most, however, took their chances and signed labor contracts with their previous enslavers. But there would be a courageous few that would try their best to realize the American dream now that they are free, and their full freedom by joining the military and using those wages and that experience to own land, to venture out and own land for the very first time. It's here in the 1870s, at the tail end of the century, where we see the first instances of Black towns and Black townships that were found. The first instances of urbanism that is influenced and financed almost primarily by African Americans. These early all-Black towns were modest structures and enclaves, similar to the European colonial outposts a few centuries earlier, but it was theirs. Like most towns, these small increments and interventions were laying the groundwork for something bigger to happen in the future, a concentrated area to develop so as to sustain and create value. The towns were molded after the very places that African Americans were not allowed to be in without permission. Virtually none of these Black towns exist today. A great deal of them, were completely destroyed and burned to the ground. Thousands of Black Americans died in the process. Reasons were politically motivated. In particular, these cases that I'm showing you here, you have voter suppression and retaliation in Hamburg, South Carolina. You have essentially a coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina, after the first Black persons were elected to local office. And then in Thibodeau, the cause was over fair pay and work treatment by employers. What this era represents, though, is the first time as American citizens that Black Americans unconstitutionally had their life, their land, their property, their homes, their communities, their urbanism taken away from them, in addition to the moral issues with it. So now let's end on the 20th century, wrap up here, where we get a variety of different additions to our public society, many of them that we would debate objectively in a contemporary sense. But nonetheless, at the beginning of the 20th century, the country, again, is expanding, but expanding in a controlled way, in a still somewhat sustainable and efficient way. Still multimodal, still building new roads and things of the such to support car infrastructure, right? But still not completely taken apart as we would know these cities to become in the future. At the start of the 20th century, though, as it relates to the built environment, the urbanism, and its relationship with African Americans and other people of color, African Americans would again, as they did in the later 19th century, would again in the beginning of the 20th century try to build a coherent, as we call it, coherent and stable physical framework for themselves. Now only 50 and 60 years removed from slavery. Surely African Americans can start to be seen as citizens in theory and in practice now. The opportunities came in places in the city that land was deemed to have no value. These lands were often in low-lying areas, swamped or flooded areas, adjacent to railways, and never in the heart of the city at the particular time, which is where, at that particular time, where the most valued land was. This is the case for Mr. Ottawa G. Gurley, who is the founder of Greenwood in Oklahoma. And I'm using Greenwood because it's probably the most famous example, but there are many other examples of this. But Mr. Ottawa G. Gurley, who purchased the 40 or so acres and founded Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's important to note that the creation of the Black community, or Black communities at that particular time, was not one out of desire. African Americans, I think at large, were not waking up and saying, oh, I want to start a Black town. These towns were begun and founded out of necessity because the urbanism that did exist didn't allow them to contribute or participate. The reason they exist is the direct response to the racism at that time that was prohibiting Black Americans from building their lives amongst the rest of mainstream society. A truly American theme, deemed un-American because of the skin color of the person in that particular American pursuit. And so here, Ottawa G. Gurley began Greenwood incrementally with a few modest mainstream structures and houses. The first was a boarding house, the image that you see at the top of your screen here, that was primarily meant to house migrants coming up from a particular area, Greenwood, Mississippi, which is where the Greenwood community in Oklahoma gets its name from. Some of the first migrants to that particular area were former slaves or children of former slaves that came from the Greenwood, Mississippi area. In the span of about 25 years, Greenwood, under the leadership of Ottawa G. Gurley and some of his other Black investors, grew into a vibrant, self-sustaining community and had all of the essentials required for any modern town at that particular time. It grew to a community of over 10,000 residents. There was a bricklaying company that supplied all the building materials and lumberyard that supplied all the building materials for the structures within its confines. Again, starting a dedicated bricklaying and lumberyard because the one that already exists couldn't be accessed by African Americans. There was a YMCA, a theater, a Black-owned transit network, buses. There was pool halls, barber shops, auto repair shops, many other goods and services. Everything that you needed was here in Greenwood. Schools, churches, Black hospitals, because the regular hospital didn't attend to African Americans. Ottawa G. Gurley himself, in this 25 to 30 year period, amassed a diverse real estate portfolio at that time, valuing about $8 million in value. What Greenwood represented, like many towns like it, was thousands of Black families, individuals, finally being able to find a space in America to build their lives and move up the economic ladder, just as their white American counterparts had hundreds of years ago. For them, this was the American dream. Greenwood, again, like many others, became a 35-block haven for Black Americans at the turn of the century. And it took 18 hours to destroy 25 years worth of savings, scraping, building, planning, planting, and praying. 25 years of good quality urbanism. In this particular instance, it happened exactly on my birthday, May 31st, 1921. Between around $50 million of legally insured private property was brought to rubble. Those homes of those 10,000 residents were completely destroyed. Nearly all the businesses were lost. Hundreds of land-owning, tax-paying American citizens were brutally beaten and killed in public space, in urbanism, over the unimproved accusation that a young Black teen fondled a young white woman in an elevator, which turned out not to be true. A mob of white Americans deployed almost a warlike assault on the neighborhood, including arson, shooting, and yes, even dropping makeshift bombs. Both Gurley and his partners lost most of their fortunes, completely wiped away. Insult added to injury, the insurance agents that insured these buildings would not fulfill the property loss of the value of the property loss in damage claims filed by the Black homeowners and the commercial landowners in terms of the property that they lost in this particular massacre. In the end, there was no recompense. There was no restitution under law, even though all the proper channels were followed. These citizens were now refugees in their own land. Again, millions of dollars of wealth consolidated in these 40 acres in northern Tulsa were wiped away from an entire generation or two of African Americans. Again, many of them remember being former slaves or were the children of former slaves. We're only 50, 60 years removed from slavery at this particular point. And again, Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Greenwood, Oklahoma, is certainly not the exception, right? This infamous backlash against Black towns, communities, Black urbanism occurred all over the country, North and South, and it happened hundreds of times. These are just some of the instances. While society is benefiting from these increasing improvements and investments into the public realm, as we see on the diagram on the left, Black Americans are prohibited from living alongside their fellow white Americans and are having their neighborhoods destroyed unjustly. Millions of dollars of value lost and uncompensated for, and thousands of lives lost. Alongside the destruction of physical property, there's also the brutal loss of life. And although harsh to look at, I bring it up in this context for one reason and one reason only. Because these are happening in a public forum. These are happening in the spaces, in our squares, in our docks, on our docks, in our streets, for everybody to look at as a public spectacle. These are the methods that we chose to use to exude our values, and how we chose to use public space, how we chose to use our urbanism. And so anchoring the latter part of the 20th century was the creation of modern zoning. And there are isolated examples at this particular time, isolated examples of race-based zoning at the turn of the century, chiefly in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area against Chinese immigrants and also African Americans. But in Baltimore, it represents the first time a citywide comprehensive zoning law based on race was voted into law. Baltimore's initiative influenced other cities to pass similar laws to regulate the influx of African Americans into their cities. The city of Atlanta made popular the now familiar race districts that correspond to a specific geography on the map. In all instances, zoning was needed, as it was purported at that time, zoning was needed to protect public peace, to maintain law and order, to limit civil disturbance, to protect against disease. This is disingenuous because it is not Black Americans who are the one disturbing the peace, as it were. After a few run-ins with Supreme Courts across the land, the groundwork was made clear for standardizing zoning across the country that was able to meet, that was able to get around the racial bias mentioned in it, or so it seemed. As law professor Ernest Fruin states, quote, zoning masquerading as an economic measure made manifest by restrictive uses and dimensional standards and parcel minimums was the most reasonable means of accomplishing the same end, that is, zoning in cities based on race and ethnicity. And the foundation of our current system for zoning was born, motivated primarily by a need to control, restrict, and regulate Black Americans and indeed other immigrant groups as well in the built environment. With zoning, there was now a legal way to predefine the character and quality of a neighborhood bounded by invisible walls. Zoning could dictate who could live where and what the value of those places could potentially be. And that leads us to the end of the 20th century. As again, we're realizing that a lot of those initial investments are older now. And we need to re-up at this particular time. We need to reinvest, right? But instead of doing that and reinvesting in those core cities, we make the decision to expand outward, to reestablish new places, new outposts with new infrastructures, and to leave the ones that we've invested in at the onset of the beginning of our society essentially to degrade. And this is where most of our contemporary conversation begins. The conversations that we've been having as urbanists, or even outside of CNU, just in general, the conversations about equity tend to begin at this particular era in the 50s, and completely disregard all the things that we've just talked about rather swiftly that happened before that led up to this point. As cities expanded and sprawled outward from their dense and efficient cores, a successive series of maps for most urban areas, large or small, were created to guide and yes, restrict the built environment. These maps are not to be isolated, but they are to be looked at in concert with one another as they build upon one another, adding additional layers of protection or restrictions, depending on where you are within that map. A common phenomenon is the uncanny relationship between the HOLC, or redlining maps, and their predecessors, the first zoning maps for cities. Whereas the latter zoning maps dictate where, who can live where and what they can build. The former, these redlining maps, establishes a national valuation system for those built environments. In the Atlanta example, Black zones fall directly inside those red hatched areas, which is the map on your left. You can sort of see that sort of saturated area. That is where African Americans, based on zoning, were allowed to live based on the law. And it just so happens to fall directly within the redlining of the redlined areas, or the lowest value land areas. And the inverse is true for our fellow white Americans, right? These zoning maps, these variations on zoning maps, are guiding the development patterns of our cities. Moving into the 50s, and the next successive layer of mapping, came in the routing of our national interstate system, using zoning and HLOC maps as a guide, seemingly, and through eminent domain, was used to confiscate land and property inhabited, and in some cases owned by African Americans, and as well other undesirable immigrant groups. Highways typically ran through Black inhabited built environments, or Black inhabited urbanism, while running around the perimeter of areas that were primarily held by working class and blue collar white Americans. Detroit is a great, my hometown is a great example of this. And again, these are just one-offs, but this phenomena, you can find a variation in part or in full of this sort of phenomena in just about every city where you have these sort of maps that were put into practice. A couple of slides here, and then we'll end. So when we talk about the mid-20th century and the subsidies that undergirded these zoning maps, or these variation of zoning maps, and the urbanization and the redevelopment and the expansion of our core cities, or some might say the flight away from core cities, the subsidies differ depending on where you are located in the built environment. First and second ring suburbs got economic incentives facilitated through the various forms of zoning to build, own, and maintain private homes, which then became the primary mechanism for building wealth in America. In the city, the older parts of the built environment, where land was confiscated to build highways, subsidies were used to build rental models where a good deal of folks had previously been owners. Many of the private home owning opportunities are still around and were able to be financially leveraged by their owners in other ways down the line. For example, many of the Levitt towns that were built in this era have increased and held their value multiples over. The same cannot be said for those in the core cities that were centered around rental options. Many have fallen into disrepair and have been demolished, as is the case with the Frederick Douglass housing project in my hometown. So folks argue that these practices were unfair at this particular time. They were unequal, they were unequitable. The same opportunities to build, sustain, and grow in the chosen built environment of that particular individual's choice was not given to many Black Americans. They spoke out, they petitioned, they protest. And what happened, it seems, is a cyclical thing. Similar to the past, it seems, when some try to speak up and change things, they again paid the ultimate price for it in both life and in property. I'm careful to talk about death in this particular forum, again, because, again, this is not a civics class. But the assassinations and the murders and the violence I give voice to in front of you all is not because they're extremely important, which they are, but it's more so because of where they happen. Again, these are happening, each of these happen either in public space or in a public forum where many are watching. They occur publicly and in public space, and in front of the backdrop of the buildings and on the stages of our streets for all to see. And that again ensued another round of destruction of private property, et cetera, right? I mean, we've seen that happen on before. And so here we are as we come to a close. So here we are in the 21st century. We again have the opportunity to fix and invest into the places that we've already built, or continue to keep our great urbanism on the outer perimeter where only a few folks can reach them. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that there is slight nuance to this maxim. There's a slight nuance to achieving this. For example, because of our changing climate, it may not be viable to continue to build in certain areas of our cities. That makes complete sense. And that's a topic for another on the park bench. But by and large, a complete reinvestment in core cities is warranted. It matters because the decisions that we've made since the 18th century and beyond have shaped and continue to influence the built environment of today. And as I have attempted to show in 30 minutes, 300 years of history, which is impossible, the built environment has historically been harmful to Black Americans, persons of color, and certain undesirable immigrant groups, generation after generation. Urbanism in all its variations, good or bad, throughout the years has been used to staunch and limit the economic vitality and community stability of Black neighborhoods. This is why equity is so important. The effects of the past we still feel today. And some of this stuff is still happening. And so here are just a couple of facts of the ramifications of previous decisions that we've made beginning in this case, beginning in the 1930s. 74% of neighborhoods that were originally graded as red line, or essentially having no value, are still today valued or have families that live in them that exist either below a low income financial rate or below the poverty line. Within that, 65% of those original neighborhoods, again, redlined, are still to this day primarily minority demographics. At least 50% of them, meaning that at least 50% of those regions contain people of color, right? So again, we've gotten rid of those practices 50, 60 years ago, right? But we're still in a contemporary society, in contemporary urbanism, still feeling the ramifications and the effects of those decisions that we've made 50 plus years ago. And so considering the protests and the spectacles of today in the built environment, it seems we are merely running through a cycle again. We do ourselves a disservice if we separate them from the motivations of the past and the historic treatment in the built environment that these demographics have faced. Now, I am not here, as I like to say, I'm not here to promote the means and methods of these demonstrations, right? Or I am only here to affirm the message behind them, and that the message has that the message has roots that are centuries deep. And so I'm of the belief that you can't talk about stuff that's happened in contemporary sense without looking at the precedent that helped influence that. The same can be said not just for our buildings, but how we use our space. It even extends to the use of our public spaces and our streets and our squares that hold the built environment together. The built environment used historically and concurrently as a stage for public humiliation and punishment. What's visibly different now is that these decisions made by our previous generation of leaders and policymakers are now affecting everyone, not just Black Americans and people of color. Yes, the economic drivers in these towns no longer exist as they did when they were founded, but so too are gone and removed the mechanisms that afforded towns the ability to adapt to changes in economic climates and changes in technology. Thousands of cities across our country are frozen in time because of past decisions about urbanism, which I argue were chiefly racially motivated at the time they were enacted. Now, in a contemporary sense, we can't provide housing. We can't support small business. We can't invigorate our main streets. And we have established a pattern of devaluing land in the core of cities to the point where nothing gets done. And so I'll end with these last two slides. for me, on a personal level in America, the only way it makes sense is if it makes sense. Thinking about the myriad of times that African Americans and other groups, person of color groups in America, have attempted to pursue their desire to build something for themselves, and the equal amount of times those desires have been thwarted through unconstitutional violence, through public policy, and through economic disincentives, signifies to me the myriad of times that Black Americans have had to begin again through no fault of their own. But we can sometimes get distracted from the real metric here, which is not only who can own and harness, who can own land and who can harness a piece of the built environment, who can own and harness a piece of the built environment, but the real metric here is who can capitalize and realize the value of that physical framework and the quality of the public spaces that hold it together on the periphery. Homeownership today is still the primary metric to evaluate an individual Americans' wealth and financial equity. The rate of home ownership for all demographics has steadily increased since the 1920s. African Americans, since they were allowed to own land, have always trailed their fellow white citizens by at least 20 points. That's sort of held consistently across the years. And since the heydays of the FHA and the VA loans that funded the suburbs of America, the rates have remained relatively stable. So still 20 points back behind many white Americans, but relatively stable across that span of time. But again, this is not the metric that we should be looking at. What's much more concerning is the value placed on that ownership. These are, again, contemporary byproducts of previous decisions that we've made. So yes, the stability of persons of color, African Americans, in terms of their ownership and their buy-in of the built environment has remained consistent. But because of the decisions that we've made, successive decisions that we've made over the years, the value of that ownership is completely off the rails in terms of when you compare those that were able to benefit from those policies and those that were not able to benefit from those policies in a contemporary sense. And I would leave you with this slide, a slide that I showed before, but I think is a good one to end on. So since the very moment of our great country realized and granted, at least in theory, citizenship and humanity to its African ethnic population, Black Americans have struggled at large to find a respite where they can operate in the pursuit of the American dream unencumbered, similar to how, again, their white countrymen did in the 16th and 17th centuries. The land is littered with the remnants of these attempts to do so, spanning centuries. Although some of these instances seem far away, it's really not. The oldest person, for example, the oldest person who had an enslaved parent only died 2 years ago, which is crazy to think about. At a bare minimum, we must invest in cities and acknowledge what happened there before we intervene. And I talked about that before. Whatever it may be, and these instances will vary from place to place. But in going beyond, I see cities taking up the mantle and their policymakers to study and debate what a restorative program would or could look like in the 21st century. This, again, is a debate for another time. And so with that, I will leave you, and hopefully we can have some conversation around questions. Oh, I didn't mean to stop sharing that.
You can put it back up.
Yeah. Sorry about that. All right, there we go.
All right. Well, thank you, Marcus. That's a tall order to go through 300 years of complex history, in less than an hour. You did well, as I had no doubt. I know, folks, that we are at the hour mark, and some folks may have to peel off, but if you have questions, please go ahead and add those into the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. I'll be going through those. We have a little bit of time. We're able to go over just a little bit. And if you aren't able to stay on for your question, then there will be a recording of this webinar, and you can see your question answered after the fact. I want to thank Marcus as a board member at CNU. I'm the president of CNU, Mallory Batchus. This is a conversation that is, it was so well received at Congress. I thought that, I heard a lot of feedback from folks that they were really grateful to see the connection of equity into our practice that Marcus was able to give us on the main stage on Saturday. And likewise, Mitch Silver, another CNU board member who will be recreating his main stage, his CNU 31 main stage presentation in October. So stay tuned for that on the park bench in October. But there was a lot of feedback that folks wanted to have this readily available, that, the way of thinking about the racial and social challenges that cities face in the context of our own practice is something that's, needs benefits from repeated reminders if we already have some of this history. And also that there are so many layers to the history that we are, it is that we must educate ourselves on. And I'm going to start with a question for you, Marcus, because you brought up my home city in your remarks when you were talking about the historical marker for Special Field Order 15, which is here in Savannah, where I am located. For folks that don't know, I live in Savannah, Georgia. And that marker is in Madison Square, which is one of the 22 famous squares of Savannah. And as I was thinking about that marker and some of the points you made throughout this presentation, as New Urbanists, we really focus on the the significance of the public realm and its impact on quality of life. And as you point out, the use of, or even the access to the public realm creates it. Over history has created different lived legacies with very different meanings for white communities as opposed to other communities. And so I want to ask you, what ways do you perceive New Urbanists could incorporate that understanding into our work? How can we consider the inequitable relationships to the public realm that we inherit when we work on that portion of urbanism? When we offer design of those spaces, how might we consider that we talk about the public realm? Dare I say we glorify the public realm often, and that may have implications to how our message is being received by different communities. I think, there are certainly good examples here in Savannah. Just, this past week, last week, the approval of renaming what was formerly Calhoun Square into Taylor Square, which is named after the first Black nurse during the Civil War. But that, feels like a pittance compared to the lived legacy that many of these public spaces may carry. And so I wanted to sort of probe you a little bit about that, from a design perspective and from a communicating perspective. How can we do better as New Urbanists?
Yeah. So I think it's good to separate it that way too, Mallory, from a design perspective, but then also from maybe a more personal perspective. From a design perspective, at least one of the things I try to do, whether it's a project for a building, an individual piece of architecture, or and especially if it's a project that has to do with some level of neighborhood design, even if the clients weren't, or the people that I'm working with weren't going to do it before, I always advocate for starting with level setting with history. Primarily because, and I've seen this just from my own family and interacting with other communities where predominantly African Americans live. Again, I mentioned in the talk that it seems like a lot of this stuff is far away, but one of the strongest sort of mechanisms in I think African American culture is this idea of sort of storytelling. This idea of passing down things that happened in families from generation to generation, primarily because that's one of the only ways that we could document, what really happened, right? And so I think that still plays forward in today. And so I say that to say that when we're going into some of these areas that have these sort of storied histories, and you think that, we're 100 years removed from, when Tulsa happened, or, whatever massacre happened near you, right? It's not really that far in the minds of the people that have been there for decades, right? And so I'm amazed at how much inroads, how much social equity I can build with people just by acknowledging the instances that happened before I even got there. And I, as a Black person myself, I find myself being an insider. I remember when I was working with Deru Tadani down in Atlanta. Even though I was a Black person, I was still an outsider from that particular area, right? I don't know anything about what happened here in Atlanta. I didn't have to live through that, right? And I perhaps the same thing can be said for somebody if they came to Detroit, right? And so across the board, as designers and practitioners, a lot of inroads and a lot of trust can be built from just by acknowledging the work. And then I think the piece after that is what I've sort of ended on this slide, is the work that a lot of designers, planners, and policymakers are beginning to take up now, trying to attach to the built environment incentives similar to how incentives were attached to land and buildings, less than 100 years ago, to help build and undergird our built environments, right? Another round of that, in some form, I think that's up for debate, but another round of that sort of incentive from a restorative standpoint, I think are actively being debated and molded around in the psyche of a lot of our societies today, which I think is very exciting for me, because again, it's people, and I not to say the country, but it's people within the country actually realizing that, hey, there's something wrong here. And, if we are trying to be proponents of urbanism in urban places, then this is what it's going to take, right? We gotta try to make recompense for some of the stuff that happened in the past, because that's the byproduct of what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've led into a question that our friend Matthew Petty raised, which is, talking about modern reparations. Like, what does that program actually look like? And like you said, some communities are navigating this. Evanston, Illinois, I know is working through a program, an example that comes to mind. But Matthew's question is, would it be different if it's implemented by a municipality rather than at the state or federal level? Just sort of thinking about the subsidiarity of government, and where do these lessons land? Who is responsible, or who has the means? It may not even be the responsibility exactly, but it's the mechanisms or the policy means to be able to enact these changes.
Yeah, and that's such a great question. And the short answer is I don't have an answer. But the slightly shorter or slightly longer answer is that on the surface and in theory, I think, whoever had a part in doing the harm is also responsible for making amends. Now, again, that looks different depending on where you are. As you mentioned, cities and states are in different conditions, right? And so what that means to me is that these reparative measures will look different. And I think they should look different. I think we also erroneously get tied up in reparations strictly meaning cash, which I think is not the way to look at this, right? And again, I applaud those cities and states across the country that are beginning to take up the mantle to discuss this, because alongside perhaps a small cash incentive, right, put that to the side, they're also debating all these other things that could help realize a financial value, but do not come in the form of cash, right? You know, things like tax incentives, tax breaks. I think land banks have those states and cities that have land banks have a critical role to play here in these conversations, right? So I think it takes on different forms in different places. And it may be that you know, certain cities partner with the states, right? I mean, states get their zoning power from the cities get their zoning power from the states, right? And so that's sort of the lineage of how these things got enacted. And I think there's a partnership there that can help to repair that. And I think it's up to the people within those cities and states and those leaders to figure out what can be done and how we can get it done, right? But again, I'll just state for the fact, and I'm happy to say that it's happening here in Detroit where I live too, which is fantastic. But you know, again, they'll just take on different shapes and forms depending on where you are in the country, right? And as I think they should, because different maladies happen in different places, right? In different magnitudes as well.
Yeah, as new urbanists, we understand the importance of context, right? This should make sense to us. So that sort of leads me into a question Stephanie Bothwell had, which is, so say you have 30 minutes with Secretary Fudge, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. What points do you make to her? What would you like to ask from her that would change the way cities address the racial harms of the past?
And Stephanie coming with the ringers. Man, that's a really good question, Stephanie. If I had 30 minutes, I think it would be a question centered around the idea of reparations. And this is not to say that a reparative program is to be funded by the federal government. I'm not saying that, but I think one of the things that a federal government can do is be a champion for certain things, particularly from the executive branch, right? You know, I think, you know, part of being executive is to be a representative of moral good, a representative of the direction that we should shoot to achieve, right? And so I think that's where organizations or departments like HUD can sort of play in this discussion that we're having, is the fact that we need to be having these discussions for X, Y, and Z, and what that would look like. You know, maybe some sort of campaign similar to what we're doing here, where, you know, we're giving folks the information to which they can use to make decisions, make policy decisions at the local level, right? As they see fit, right?
Yeah.
So I think we'd have a real conversation about that, and I'll put a button on that to also mention that it was, just so folks are aware, and you already mentioned it as well, that the one reparative program that we almost got off the ground was won by the federal government with Special Field Order 15, right? So there is a role for our national government to play, perhaps a little bit different than it was, you know, 160 years ago. Our politics are different now, and I think as all things need to change to reflect that, but that doesn't mean we can't get anything done.
Yep. So I have a couple more questions here that are a bit of a blend of some questions we got. One of which Sarah Baldwin brought up, but I've seen the thread in a couple of different ways. Thinking about social inequity, social inequality in other groups in the public, in the larger urban public, the unhoused, recovery communities, low income, etc. These are groups that may be growing in cities across the country, and they, in what ways do you think that there are parallels? In what ways are there divergences and from the inequities of racial groups in our cities, and how cities might respond as a result?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question because in some respects, I think some of these are sort of offshoots of the sort of larger picture of inequity, right? Like, and indeed, talking about populations like the unhoused or just low income people, that sort of demographic ex, spans the entire spectrum of people, right? Um, so I think that sort of complicates it in terms of strictly being a racial thing. But I do think I just had a thought and I just lost it. I do think that there are similarities here, right? I mean, again, we're talking about going back to this idea that I talked about in terms of equity, right? And equity being used as a tool to make things equal, which is how I look at equity, right?
Yeah.
So that things are equal, right? And so, what are, and again, it's kind of hyper local, but it's not because I mean, we're probably maybe one of the reasons why we can't provide quality housing for folks is, one of the reasons is because of, old policies that restrict us from doing other stuff.
Yeah.
The other element to that is just it's expensive to build, right? So there's all these other elements, and I think this is where local cities, municipalities, counties can sort of play a role with that, and sort of being equitable from that perspective, right? But so I think without running the risk of like being long-winded, I think there's a relationship there, but I think there's a little bit more nuance that needs to go into figuring out exactly what that is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So that sort of leads me to what I'm going to leave as our final question. And it has to do with how you opened the presentation and thinking about new urbanism as a movement. And we have, this is our 30th anniversary this year. We have been working to enact the principles of the charter for 30 years. And, you quoted the piece about standing for the restoration of existing urban centers and towns within coherent metropolitan regions, and talking about the sort of framework that we look at cities from. So my question, and I'm going to add a piece that Dan Hoyt suggested in the comments. My question to you is, what do you think our biggest obstacles are to that mandate? What do you see as the biggest opportunities for reinvesting in the cities that we may not have made as much progress on over the past 30 years? I don't think you said it today, but it is emblazoned in my mind. At CNU 31, you talked about islands of fantastic, and that we have these really excellent examples of urbanism that new urbanists have produced, and they're very isolated from each other. And how do we get that carpet to be more entwined? What do you see as the obstacles to that? What do you see as the opportunities? Or as Dan Hoyt said in the comments, what does success look like 30 years from now?
Yeah, great question. I'll start with the back end, which is what success looks like. I think success looks like us. If I were to take an archetype and use as a model, any mid-tier city that's been blown up because of its economic driver, its initial economic driver leaving, and then subsequent things happen to complete its sort of deterioration. Success would look like a full restoration of, interpreted differently, but a full restoration of that particular area. I look at some of these great new urbanist towns, which again, I as an architect, trained as an architect, I objectively love, but the urbanist in me, or the urban designer in me, the pseudo urban planner in me, takes slight issue with the location, right? When we have all these opportunities in cities, and that leads me to the reasoning, which is it's just damn hard. You know what I mean? For a lot of reasons. I mean, there's a lot of one of my friends used to say all the time, the more you allow something to linger, the more it's going to flourish, right? And so when I think about the issues that have arose in our cities over time and the subsequent chances that we've had to solve them, all that's doing is just allowing those things to flourish, right? And so that's why it's so difficult to do it today, right?
Yeah.
And I'm until somebody convinces me otherwise, I am a champion of incremental development, primarily because, as I showed in the presentation, that's exactly how we started these things in the first place. Whether they are colonial, the kernels of those colonial towns that have now grown into metropolises, Boston, DC, Savannah, all these places, they started off as little increments, right? The same can be said for those first Black towns. They started off as little increments, right? And grew organically, right? And so when I think when we're trying to intervene into places that already exist, I think we're trying to use a built-out strategy in a place that can't handle that. And that, from my perspective, I think that's never going to work. It may work from a development standpoint for that unitary project, but it's not going to help in terms of creating walkable places for all people, right? Because you're inevitably going to be pressing out more people, right? But when you build it incrementally and organically, and in addition to that, and this is where a reparation conversation can happen, when you attach to that programs to support people doing stuff in their own neighborhoods, you can now begin to recreate that same momentum that happened in the 17th century with the kernels, or 18th century with those kernels of our colonial towns increasing in vibrancy, and places like Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, that began as a kernel and eventually grew into this vibrant neighborhood of 10,000 people. We didn't build it all at once. We built it in small increments and allow people to intervene organically, which allows you to sustain that place sustainably, right? And so that's what success looks like for me. Those are the obstacles. It's just hard, and perhaps people don't want to deal with certain people. But this is where I think a lot of us can begin to partner together, right? Some of us have certain skill sets that others don't have. If we can agree that there needs to be, that we need to focus on this issue, I think that's the harder part. The easier part is just getting the people, because we all know people that can help, and we bring it on teams. We've been on charrettes. We have the database of people within our ranks to do the work. We just need to agree on what the focus of work needs to be.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. As you were talking, it reminded me that I think a lot of the time in my role, since I've come into this role at CNU, that I think a lot about doing better to make sure that a broader community can see themselves in the Islands of Fantastic, right? But I also think that it's important for those of us creating these Islands of Fantastic to be able to see our work in the Greenwoods, because they are similarly, that's an example of a new town. It's a new town that met a catastrophic end, and that's this sort of, ownership of these legacies of creating place that I think we really need to bring into our understanding in a little more meaningful way. So,
Absolutely.
well, I think we have gone quite a bit over. Any final words, Marcus, that you want to share with folks?
I, again, just want to thank you and CNU, and also the membership, for allowing conversations like these to happen. If you would ask me 10 years ago, as a person struggling to find a professional organization to be a part of as an architect, would I be able to start having conversations like this amongst the sort of larger umbrella of urbanism? I might not have believed you, but to see that we're at least having these discussions and debates around facts that happen and what to do about them is very heartening for me. So I want to thank you, Mallory, and the rest of staff, and also my fellow urbanists for taking some time out today to listen to me yap.
Well, it was much more than that, Marcus, and I want to thank you on behalf of CNU for recreating this presentation, taking the time out of your day to reshare it so we could have it in posterity. And for everyone who's still on, thank you for spending some extra time with us today. The recording of this will be up on CNU's YouTube channel. And if there are any further questions that Marcus and I can answer for you, please feel free to reach out. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you so much. And thank you, Marcus, for this wonderful presentation.
Of course. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.